Hey everyone, my name is Carl and this is going to be a little tutorial in Unreal Engine 4 on how to set up a local multiplayer system that can use one controller and one keyboard or any number of controllers as well. This is something that I struggled with in the beginning and I'm still fairly new to Unreal Engine, so there may be a better way to do this, but this is just one way that I figured out and works well. So firstly, let's start by getting two players into the game. So let's delete that one. This is the network multiplayer start. We're not going to use that now. Let's just add a player start. I deleted the player because the game creates a player automatically if there's not one in the game. So the plane on which everything works in this game is 1200. I'm using the side scroller template for Unreal Engine, so you can just create a new project and select the side scroller template if you want to follow along. Okay, so we added a player start. I'm going to add a few more. Just going to hold Alt and drag to make a copy. Let's make a few more just so that we have a couple of places for the players to spawn. Okie dokie. So if we hit play, our player starts there. If you hit play again, it starts in another place. Cool. So now we want to spawn in a second player. I'm going to do this in the level blueprint. You can do that in the game mode or any other blueprints you set up as well. I'm just going to use the level blueprint for now. So what we want is, we want to get the begin play event. Cool, so this just gets triggered the first time you start playing the level. And we're going to drag off this and say create player. There we go. Okay, this -1 just means that it's going to automatically assign the next available slot for the player controller. So player 1 is going to have a 0 at their controller ID, and player 2 is going to automatically receive a 1. So if we compile and run it again, cool. Now we have two players in the game. The problem with the default way Unreal Engine works, for local multiplayer at least, is I'm using the controller now and it's controlling player 1, and if I use the keyboard it's also controlling player 1. I've got another controller plugged in and that uses or controls player 2 now. So what this means is if you only have one controller and you want to allow your players to use one controller and a keyboard, that's not going to work with this default setup. You can go into settings, project settings, maps and modes. Let's make this split vertical. This is just going to split the screen vertically instead of horizontally. Now you see an option here in 4.15. I'm not sure when they introduced this. Skip assigning gamepad to player 1. Now this kind of sounds like it's going to fix the problem. Whoops, controller's freaking out a bit. There we go. Cool. So if you play now, controller 1 is controlling player 2. The keyboard is controlling player 1. But let's say the player has two controllers now. The second controller doesn't do anything because that's not assigned to either of the players. So this isn't going to work either. So let's go back and untick that again. So now we've got controller 1 controlling player 1 and the keyboard also controlling player 1. So what we want is to allow player 2 to use the keyboard or the second controller. So to do that, we're going to go into our side scroller BP blueprints and open up the side scroller character. Cool. So this is a movement input. It uses the default input settings that you can set up in the project settings. But we're going to split the keyboard and the gamepad for our purposes. So instead of using input axis, we're going to say gamepad stick left thumbstick x-axis. So we're going to use that. and that. If you hold control, you can move these nodes. Cool. Okay, so now the gamepad is controlling the left and right movement. Okay, so we're going to create an action for the left key, or an event. There we go, that's when you press the left key, and then the right key as well. Cool, so now we got the left key and the right key. The problem here is, well, firstly, that wants a scale value, and that scale value is assigned by the controller. So if you use a keyboard, that's going to be 0, and your player is not going to move. So we're just going to copy this for the left and the right. And for left, we want to make that -1, and for right, we want to make that 1. Another problem is this is only triggered once. When you press the key, it's triggered once, and then when you release the key, it's triggered once again, that one. So if you plug that in there, and that in there, and we play, I have to keep tapping the key because it's only triggered once. And if you press right, so that's not going to work. So the thing is, this wants to get triggered every frame actually. And to trigger it every frame, let's hold Alt and just click on that to disconnect it. Hold Alt and click. So now we're going to get the tick event. Event tick. So this event gets triggered every frame. So instead of just assigning that to there, we're going to create a gate that if you press that left, it's going to open the tick and allow it to go through to there. And if you press right, it's going to open the gate and allow the tick to go through and trigger that thing every frame. And then when you release the key, it's going to close the gate again. So let's right click and press or type gate. Bloop. Cool. So now we want this to go there, and we want it to go there as well for another gate. So let's just copy and paste this gate for now. There we go. So to allow us to split this event, basically, we're going to drag off it and type sequence. There we go. So it goes there, it enters, and it enters, and then it exits. Let's just do this to test it quickly. And so it starts closed. So this is going to trigger every frame, but it's going to get there, and then the gate's closed, and this isn't going to trigger. So nothing is going to happen. What we need to do is, when you press left, we want to open this gate, and that'll allow the input to go through, or the execution to go through. And then when you release the key, we want it to close the gate again. Same for the right key as well. So open and close, compile and save. Let's see. Roop, roop. Cool. So now the keyboard works again. But you'll see it's still the controller is playing or controlling player 1, and the keyboard is also controlling player 1. Okay, so this side-scroller character blueprint needs to know if it's player 1 or if it's player 2. And to do that, we're going to create a player index. There's one here. Let's just delete it and create it again. So we're going to create a new variable and call that player index. Okay, and we want to make that an integer. Cool. And the default value is going to be 0. As player 1 is going to be 0, and then player 2 is going to be 1, and so forth. For our purposes, we're only going to have 2 players, so it's going to be 0 and 1. Now we have to set this so that the blueprint can check that value and see if it's player 1 or player 2. And to set that, we're going to go back to our level blueprint where we created player 2. So this creates player 2 as player 1 is automatically created when the level starts or when the gameplay starts. So this gives us the player controller reference. So that's not the character yet. We're going to have to drag off it and type get controlled pawn. And this will give us a reference to whatever that controller is controlling. And in our case, it's going to be this side scroller character. But the editor doesn't know that yet. That only gets assigned when the play begins, basically. So for editing purposes, we're going to have to cast to, and then we want that side scroller character, So that one. And then we plug into there. And that's going to check if they match up. And if they match up, it's going to execute this pin. So now we can manipulate this character. And it's going to be the one that is controlled by player controller 1, as the first one was 0, and this one automatically gets assigned to 1 then. So this is going to be player 2's character blueprint. So then we can go set player index. And that gets set. And we want player 2 to be index 1. Cool. Compile. There we go. Okay, so how the system is going to work is we're going to, let's just hold Alt and click to disconnect those again. We're going to check if it's player 1, then we're going to send this keyboard inputs. We're going to send that to player 2. So let's do that. Let's drag off here and create an if statement or a branch. If you just type if, it brings up the branch. Same here, if branch. Cool. So now we want to check if this is player 1. And to do that, we're going to right click and type get player index. Okay. So let's drag off that. It equals integer. So if this is 0, in other words, if this is player 1, then we want to send the input to player 2. So for player 2 to be able to receive that input, we're going to create custom events. Custom event. We're going to call that press left. So when that gets triggered, it's going to press left. And we're going to create another one. Custom event. And we're going to call this press right. Boom. Cool. So now we want to send this signal, basically. We want to send that and trigger that event in player 2. So to do that, we have to get a reference to player 2, basically. So what we can do is we can, from here, we can cast to side scroller character again. But to tell it which one, we're going to have to get player 2's controlled pawn, basically, again. So we're going to go and say get player controller, and from there we're going to say get controlled pawn. Plug that into there. So now this will give us a reference to player 2, basically. So now if we go there, drag off this, and we type press left, this will trigger that event, but only in player 2. So player 1's movement's not going to be affected. And we're going to do the same for the other key. Let's just copy this, copy and paste. There we go. We can use that same node. And except this time we're going to go to press right. Okie dokie. Okay, let's see if it works. Cool. So now the first gamepad controls player 1. The second gamepad controls player 2. And the keyboard should also control player 2. And that's not working. You know what? Get player controller 0. So that's player 1. We want to make it a 1 to make it player 2. Compile, play. So the the gamepad is controlling player 1 and the keyboard is controlling player 2. But if we hit space, player 1 still jumps. So we're going to do the same thing over here. Let's do that. Okay, we're not going to use these input actions either. So let's set up the gamepad first. So gamepad face button. The face buttons are the A, B, X, Y on a Xbox controller style controller. And the bottom one will be A, so we make that jump. And we plug that one in there, and we plug that one in there. Cool. So these things aren't triggered every frame, so we don't have to bother with gates again. We can just make it space bar. Plug that in there, and plug that in there. So now the space bar is still going to trigger the jump. But we don't want to do that. We want to do the same thing we did here. We can actually just copy these. Copy, paste. So we're going to have this again. If you press the space bar, it's going to check if it's player 1. If it's player 1, it's going to send that input through to player 2. Let's just move this up a bit. Okay, and if we release the spacebar, it's going to do the same thing. So now for press and release, we're going to need 2 new custom events. Custom event. We're going to call this press jump. And we're going to make another one, custom event. We're going to call this release jump. We're going to plug that in there, and we're going to plug that in there. Cool, so now we've got a press jump and a release jump event. And because this is already set up in the same way, it's going to get player 2 and cast to the blueprint, and then we've got player 2's character blueprint there. So now for this one, we're going to press jump. And for this one, we're going to release jump. Okie dokie. Compile. See if it works. Okay. So the gamepad controls player 1. We can jump with A. And the keyboard controls player 2. We can jump with space. But the second controller also controls player 2. So now if you have 2 gamepads plugged in, the game works just fine. But if you only have 1 gamepad, you can still play the game with 1 controller or 1 gamepad and 1 keyboard, basically. And you can just do this for all your other inputs. So if you want to make a shoot button, you can just make a shoot button here, whatever it's going to be. Another thing, you can add multiple inputs to this. Let's say we want the up key to also trigger this. Up key. You can just plug that in there as well, and that in there. Oops. There you go. So now we can jump with up as well. Up, up, run, 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 up, or space. Cool. So that works. And the same thing here, if you want to play with WASD instead of the arrows, let's just add a W key. There we go. Same thing. You can add as many keys as you want here for the different control options. So here left is going to be A key. Keyboard A. Just going to plug that in there and there. And right is going to be D. Just keyboard D. Open, close. Cool. So now You can control player 2 with the arrows, or WASD. Well, S doesn't do anything because we don't have a crouch set up. Cool, so that works like that. The gamepad controls player 1. And that is it. Thank you for watching and have an awesome day.